to our discussion of the Gospel of Matthew. We will begin by looking at Matthew's historical importance. Matthew has been the preeminent Gospel of the church. It always appears first in the canon lists. The other three, their order it varies, but Matthew is always first in the canon. When other Gospels have a parallel, textual changes are almost always made to align with Matthew, so it has a prominence. It's cited far more frequently in the Fathers, some 33,000 times in the first 4 centuries. That's 30% more than John, and 100% more than Mark and Luke put together. So that's very prominent. Some reasons for Matthew's preeminence. The early church believed Matthew to be the first gospel written. It's also an excellent catechetical and liturgical source with its structure and its content. And if you have Matthew, then you have Mark. Also, Matthew has more explicit links to Israel scriptures, which was the early Christian Bible. With regard to its historical context, the authorship, there are different traditions. Matthean authorship has traditionally been held to be Matthew the Apostle. But like Mark, Matthew is anonymous. The text itself does not identify its author. Unlike Mark, which has hints to Peter, there are no real hints as to the author in Matthew. However, Levi in Mark chapter 2:14, in Luke 5:27 becomes a man called Matthew in Matthew 9:9. And Matthew the tax collector is noted in Matthew 10:3. And it's noted as just Matthew and Mark and Luke. Church tradition, the opinion of the church fathers everywhere is that Matthew is the author of the gospel that bears his name. Papias, according to Eusebius, said Matthew collected the oracles in the Hebrew language and each interpreted them as best as he could. Origen recorded in Eusebius as well. He said the first gospel was written by Matthew, who was once a tax collector, but who was afterwards an apostle of Jesus Christ. And it was prepared for the converts from Judaism and published in the Hebrew language. There are some Christian questions about tradition. Among the disciples, Matthew is not weighty as Peter is. He's not a major player in the Gospels, and therefore he must have had some connection with the book for it to be so widely attributed to him. Although church tradition believed Matthew to have been written first, we do see now with our synoptic problem resolution that he does not appear to be written first. He seems to follow Mark. The fact that Matthew deals with the virgin birth might explain why it was considered first by the early church. Again, Professor Rick Watts offers this scenario. He says the Apostle Matthew, a literate and capable bilingual tax collector, has his own collection of Aramaic materials. But acknowledging Peter's authoritative priority, he adheres to Peter's account of Jesus' own conception of the gospel as reflected in Mark, adding his own logia, his own material, and in his own more than serviceable non-translation Greek, correcting and smoothing Mark's infelicities. Matthew, the tax collector, is what we're looking at as the author. As for the date, well, most modern scholars date the book late, 80 to 90. Nevertheless, Matthew depends on Mark, and therefore probably should not be dated earlier than the late 50s AD. Matthew was written before the start of the Jewish war, it seems, as there's no mention of it. The best guess as to date would therefore be sometime after Mark, perhaps as early as the 60s. This would confirm Irenaeus' statement in the mid-2nd century that Matthew composed his work when both Peter and Paul were in Rome. So we're looking 60, 64, even up to 68. Provenance and addressees. The majority of New Testament scholars agree that Matthew was almost certainly produced in Palestine or in Syria, because Matthew has a distinctively Jewish flavor. In particular, the fact that the author takes for granted the audience's comprehension of Jewish customs and places. So this argues strongly for a Palestinian or Syrian destination. This also argues that the audience is in part racially Jewish in makeup. So Matthew was probably reading for Jewish Christians coming to terms with the claims of Jesus over against Pharisaic Judaism, perhaps facing expulsion from certain synagogues, or at the very least facing hostility, as like we see in Acts. However, Matthew is also deeply committed to the Gentile mission. Gentile inclusion is indeed the true fulfillment of Abraham and David, but they are to come to be received as Gentiles, not as proselytes to Judaism, which itself contributes to the tension. There is an obvious relation between Matthew and Mark, as we saw in the introduction of the gospel. Matthew includes around approximately 92% of Mark in his text. However, Matthew condenses Mark's prolix, extended great length narratives between 50 to 25% actually. But he keeps, he retains just over 2/3 of Mark's actual words. His additions, Matthew has 92% of Mark, but actually Mark's gospel, Matthew's gospel is only made up of around 50% of Mark's gospel. So there are obvious additions. Matthew is noted for his additions, or what we termed special Matthew before. These consist of a genealogy and birth narratives. I know Luke has these, but they're different to Matthew's. Matthew alone has the Sermon on the Mount. Luke has the Sermon on the Plain. There's the mission words. John the Baptist is expanded. Matthew has the woe sayings. He has the parables of the kingdom in chapter 13, church instruction in chapter 18, and then 3 chapters of woes to the Pharisees. All of these things are distinctive to Matthew's gospel. So we're going to stop there for a moment. We'll be back and look at the content. We're going to have a look at the narrative outline of Matthew now. We look at its structure. Matthew begins with a genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham, he says. He begins the book of the beginning. Hence, Matthew begins his narrative with beginnings, with the intent to answer, who is Jesus? So he says, Jesus is the son of David, the son of Abraham. David in the line of Israel's prophetic kingly line. Matthew is establishing Jesus' earthly right to the throne. And Abraham, son of Abraham, the blessing to the nations. The narrative structure is built around 5 teaching blocks. So it's important to remember 5 teaching blocks. Each teaching block ends with a distinct marker phrase. So the phrase goes, when Jesus had finished saying these things, or when Jesus had finished these words, or when Jesus had finished these teachings or these parables, etc. This is the marker phrase, and it appears 5 times in Matthew, and each time it concludes a block of teaching. So you can see there Matthew 7:28, Matthew 11:1, Matthew 13:53, 19:1, and 26:1. All these marker phrases, they mark out these 5 teaching blocks. Some scholars see these teaching blocks as indicative of a new Torah. 5 pieces, 5 Torah books. So they see a Jewish focus, and we'll see in a little while that Matthew is considered the Jewish gospel. So we look at the first block, chapters 5 through 7, the first teaching block. It's 111 verses, and that's what we know as the Sermon on the Mount. So it's the blessings of the new Torah. It's an exposition of the intent of the Old Testament law. Essentially, the Sermon on the Mount gives rules for life. In between the teaching, there's also other material. There's several miracles to back up his words in chapters 8 and chapters 9. The first group of miracles, leprosy, paralysis, fever are cured, and there's an emphasis on compassion. And then there's a second group of miracles which emphasize Jesus' authority. Okay, is in the realm of nature, the calming of the storm, in the realm of the supernatural, they have it, the healing of the two gathering demonics, and even in the realm of the spiritual, the healing of a paralytic along with the forgiveness of sins. And then there's another group of miracles. They speak of Jesus' own radical commitment and courage. The second block, chapter 10, there's 38 verses in this block. It's about mission. It's looking outward. So he commissions his disciples, and then he teaches many principles taught in the Sermon on the Mount are now expected to be followed by the disciples. So he has that block of teaching. In between block 2 and 3, there's in between the teaching, there's opposition to him. There's open attack by the religious leaders on Jesus' authority over the Sabbath and his source of supernatural power. Then we get to block number 3. That's chapter 13. There's 50 verses. This is the central block of teaching. Some look at it as a pivotal, as a hinge in the whole gospel. There are 7 parables of the kingdom. The parable of the soil, the weeds, the mustard seed, the yeast, the hidden treasure, the pearl, and the net. And then in between the teaching, Jesus begins to withdraw from the crowds and withdraw from danger. There are 5 successive withdrawals recorded in Matthew at this time. He first withdraws to a desert place. He still performs some miracles there. He withdraws to Phoenicia, in which he healed a Gentile woman's daughter, giving further evidence that the kingdom was opening to the Gentiles. Then he withdraws to the Sea of Galilee, where he fed the multitudes. Then Bagada, where he instructed his disciples about the fallacy in the Pharisees' teaching. And then finally, there's the withdrawal to Caesarea Philippi, where he made it known to his disciples that he was indeed the Christ. Then we go to block 4. Chapter 18, there's 33 verses in this block. He's speaking on life in the community, so it's inward looking. And he's on the way to Jerusalem. Jesus instructs his disciples concerning faith, concerning the proper role of those in authority, humility and childlikeness, salvation, forgiveness. And in between the teaching, there's more teaching of the disciples in Judea. And then there's the last miracle, the healing of 2 blind men, which take us into the 5th block, the last block, the last teaching block, chapters 23 to 25, a large block, parallel to the first block, which was a large block. We'll see that in a second, 136 verses. This is the block of teaching curses and warnings about the future. If you remember, this is a major addition by Matthew to Mark's narrative. So after the rejection of the king by the nation, now the king unveiled his rejection of the nation because of its impenitence. After the teaching, there's the plot to kill Jesus by the chief priests and the elders. The last Passover, again, Gethsemane, the arrest and the trial, the crucifixion, the resurrection, the Great Commission. That's the end of that last block. But like I said before, the 2 largest blocks are the first and the last, and they bookend the structure. They both focus initially on the block of sayings. In the first block, it's blessings, and in the last block, it's curses. So we begin block 1, chapters 5 through 7. Blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are those who mourn, blessed are the meek, and so on and so forth. And then now we'll have a look at the themes in Matthew. Curses, woe to you scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. Woe to you blind guides. Woe to you scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you have neglected the weightier matters of you have neglected the weightier matters. And woe to you, for you are like the whitewashed tombs, and on and on. So those two blocks kind of parallel themselves, except they're opposite. So that's the structure. We're going to take a break now. We come back and we'll see the themes that run through the Gospel of Matthew. In Matthew, there is a focus on the disciples. If you remember, in Mark, there's a focus in disciples as well. It's a little different. We'll get to it in just a sec. But the focus in Matthew is on making disciples. So the first thing Jesus does is the calling of the 4 disciples. And as I said, note that the disciples' role in Matthew is opposite to the role in Mark. Whereas Mark presents disciples that are slow to understand time and time again, Matthew presents them as ideal models. So the disciples are ideal models compared to Mark. I've given you some passages, some scripture there on the graphic, but I'll just read 2 of them. So you read Mark 4:13. It says, "Then Jesus said to them, don't you understand this parable? How then will you understand any parable?" In Matthew 13:6, he says, "But blessed are your eyes because you see, and your ears because they hear." Mark 8:17 through 21, I'll just read I'll read 18 and 21. It says, "Do you have eyes but fail to see, and ears but fail to hear? And don't you remember?" In verse 21, he said to them, "Do you still not understand?" Whereas in Matthew chapter 16:12, he says, "Then they understood that he was not telling them to guard against the yeast of the bread, but against the teaching of the Pharisees and the Sadducees." So there's quite a few of these contrasts, and we see that Matthew is presenting the disciples as ideal models. And then, of course, we have the concluding words in Matthew. It's about discipleship. "Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations." So we have that theme in Matthew of discipleship. There's also a wisdom theme or a wisdom emphasis in Matthew. It's seen in an emphasis on teaching. Of course, we've spoken of the 5 teaching blocks. There's an emphasis on speech. There's an emphasis on deeds and obedience. And these are all wisdom motifs from Israel's scriptures, from the Proverbs. This is the wisdom literature of the Old Testament. So we see that theme running through Matthew. Matthew is also known as the Jewish gospel. The Jewish gospel. It is universally recognized as the most Jewish of the gospels. And it begins with a genealogy, which is very Jewish. It's very important to the Jewish people. And it places Jesus in Israel's narrative. And then again, we have the 5 blocks of teaching. And as I said, they're perceived by many scholars as being a new Torah. There are 5 blocks. There's 5 books of the Torah. Then there are distinctive fulfillment sayings. Matthew says this is to fulfill, this is to fulfill, this is to fulfill. Although they were texts that people did not expect Jesus to fulfill, but still we see these fulfillment sayings repeatedly in the Gospel of Matthew. There's also the abiding validity of the law. So this is very Jewish. The abiding validity of the law, where Jesus several times says something similar to, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." So there's different ways that he says this, but it's the same meaning. Lastly, it's really Jewish in nature in that it has rabbinic patterns of argument. Obviously, you have to know some of the Jewish rabbinic patterns, but the scholars tell us that Matthew has these rabbinic patterns of argument, and because of these 5 reasons and others, it's considered the most Jewish of all the Gospels, and therefore is considered the Jewish Gospel. Another summary of Matthew. Well, Matthew identifies Jesus with a high Christology. So he presents Jesus as greater than Moses, greater than Solomon. But whereas Moses speaks on God's behalf, Jesus says, I say to you, but I say to you. So Jesus has provided a new Torah for a new covenant people. Jesus is also Emmanuel, God with us. He is Isaiah's long promised presence of God himself. He's not only the Messiah, he is the presence of God. He is the unique Son of God who does what only God can do. So we've seen some of those things already. The things that only God, because he's Yahweh, he's Emmanuel, God with us. Jesus, we see also that Matthew identifies Jesus with a high Christology and that he is greater than the temple, the place that housed God's presence and gave Israel its identity. He is now the locus of God's presence for Israel and for the nations. So Matthew continues Mark's Yahweh Christology. And we see also the high Christology in that Jesus fulfills the Abrahamic and Davidic promises. As the son of David, he fulfills the Davidic covenant, and as Israel's messianic hope, as the Son of Man who rules over the nations. Matthew is considered a training manual for discipleship. He provides a description of a disciple. What does a person who follows Jesus look like, and what does it mean to look like one of the fathers, to look like one of the Father? And he also talks about what is the mission of a disciple. Why initially going to the Gentiles is apparently excluded. By the end, the mission to the nations is inherent in discipleship. Matthew answers the question, what does it mean to follow Jesus? There's a few distinctives, so we'll finish with these few distinctives. Only in Matthew's gospel does one find the following. There's the, my yoke is easy, my burden is light. Only in Matthew. If the sheep gets lost in the community, go out and get it. So there's a different emphasis on the sheep there, and it's only found in Matthew. This is a big one. The term kingdom of heaven is found only in Matthew, and it's found at least 31 times. Kingdom of heaven, kingdom of heaven. So it's very distinctive to Matthew. So those are some of the uniquenesses of the gospel. This concludes our presentation of the Gospel of Matthew. Many blessings.